The intimate venue in Dallas buzzed with anticipation as fans settled into their seats at the Majestic Theater. Unlike his massive stadium concerts, tonight's show was different, more personal, more raw. Garth Brooks had specifically chosen this historic venue for what he called his Stories and Songs Tour, where he shared the deeper meanings behind his music in a setting that felt more like a living room than a concert hall. The autumn evening carried a crisp October breeze through downtown Dallas, and the warm amber lights of the theater created an inviting glow against the darkening Texas sky. Outside, the city's skyline stretched toward the horizon, but inside, all attention focused on the simple setup. One man, one guitar, and a lifetime of stories to tell. Garth adjusted his black cowboy hat and strummed the opening chords of The Dance, his voice carrying the weight of experience that only came with decades of performing. The audience of 1,200 hung on every word, many singing along softly to the familiar melody that had soundtracked countless moments in their lives. "You know," Garth said, pausing between songs and leaning against his guitar, "this song always reminds me that some of life's most beautiful moments come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a single moment can change everything you thought you knew about your own story." In the third row, an elderly woman named Margaret Catherine Hayes sat with tears already forming in her eyes. At 78 years old, she clutched a worn leather photo album against her chest, her weathered hands trembling slightly. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a navy blue dress that had seen better days, but was clearly her finest. Next to her sat her granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Martinez, a 35-year-old nurse who had driven her grandmother from their small town of Henderson, Texas, specifically for this moment. "Are you sure about this, Grandma Maggie?" Sarah whispered, noticing her grandmother's nervousness. Margaret nodded slowly, her pale blue eyes never leaving Garth's face. "I've waited 47 years for this moment, sweetheart. I can't wait any longer." As Garth finished The Dance, he moved into Unanswered Prayers, his voice taking on an even more reflective tone. The song spoke of divine timing and the wisdom that came with understanding that sometimes what we don't get is exactly what we need. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret, who had spent decades praying for this very opportunity. During the brief pause between songs, Margaret stood up with Sarah's help, her legs shaky from both age and emotion. The album felt heavier in her hands than its actual weight suggested. It carried the burden of decades of secrets, regret, and love that had never found its proper expression. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice surprisingly strong for her small frame. "Mr. Brooks." Garth looked up from tuning his guitar, his kind eyes immediately focusing on the elderly woman. The theater fell silent, all eyes turning toward Margaret. This wasn't unusual. Fans often called out song requests or shared brief comments during his intimate shows. But something about this woman's presence felt different, more urgent. "Yes, ma'am?" Garth responded warmly, setting his guitar aside and giving her his full attention. Margaret's voice wavered as she spoke, but her words carried across the silent theater with crystal clarity. "I have something that belongs to you, something I should have given you a very long time ago." The simplicity of her statement sent a ripple of curiosity through the audience. Garth walked to the edge of the stage, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine concern as he saw the tears streaming down the woman's face. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked gently. "Margaret Catherine Hayes," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "But you used to call me Grandma Maggie." The color drained from Garth's face. In the wings, Trisha Yearwood, who had been watching the show from the side of the stage, as she often did during these intimate performances, felt her heart skip a beat. She knew that name. Or rather, she knew the absence of that name in Garth's life story. Garth had spoken to her many times about his childhood, about the grandmother who had disappeared from his life when he was just 6 years old. His father had told him she had died, that it was too painful to talk about. For over 4 decades, Garth had carried the weight of that loss, the absence of a woman who had been his primary caregiver during his earliest years, while his parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. That's not possible," Garth whispered. But even as he said it, he could see something familiar in the woman's eyes. The same pale blue that stared back at him from old mirrors. The same gentle curve of the smile that he remembered from fragments of childhood memories he'd thought were dreams. Margaret held up the leather album with shaking hands. "This will explain everything, my sweet boy. Everything I couldn't tell you then. Everything your father thought was best to keep hidden." The theater remained absolutely silent as Garth knelt at the edge of the stage, close enough now to see the details of Margaret's face, the laugh lines around her eyes that he remembered tracing with his tiny fingers, the small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen while chasing him in the backyard, the way her left hand shook slightly, just as it had when she was nervous about him climbing too high in the old oak tree. With trembling hands, Margaret passed the album up to him. Their fingers touched briefly, and in that moment, 47 years of separation seemed to collapse into nothing. Garth felt the same warmth, the same safety he'd felt as a small child, when those same hands had comforted him through nightmares and celebrated his small victories. "Open it," Margaret whispered. "Please." Garth looked out at the audience, then back at the album in his hands. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and he could see that it had been well loved, frequently opened. His name was embossed on the cover in faded gold letters, "For Troil Garth Brooks." With hands that had strummed guitars for millions of fans but now shook like a child's, Garth opened the album to the first page. The first photograph stopped his breath entirely. It was a picture of him as a toddler, maybe 2 years old, sitting on Margaret's lap in what he recognized as her old kitchen in Yukon, Oklahoma. He was laughing, his mouth wide open in pure joy, chocolate cake smeared across his face. Margaret was looking down at him with such profound love that it was almost painful to witness. But it was the handwritten note beneath the photo that broke something open in his chest. July 15th, 1965. My sweet Garth's 2nd birthday. He insisted on feeding me cake before eating his own. Even then, his heart was bigger than anything else about him. I love this boy more than life itself. Garth's hand shook as he turned the page. More photos. Him learning to walk while holding Margaret's hands, building sandcastles during a rare family trip to a lake, sleeping peacefully in her arms on Christmas morning. Each photo was accompanied by Margaret's careful handwriting, documenting moments that had been erased from his official family history. "Grandma Maggie," he whispered, and the microphone caught the words, sending them throughout the theater. Several audience members were now crying, sensing they were witnessing something profound and private. In the wings, Trisha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had never seen her husband look so vulnerable, so completely undone. Garth continued turning pages, each one revealing more of his lost childhood. Photos of Margaret teaching him to play a toy guitar, reading him bedtime stories, comforting him during a thunderstorm. The documentation of a relationship that had been central to his early development, but had vanished from his life so completely that he'd begun to question if some of his memories were real. Then he reached a page that contained no photos, only a letter written in Margaret's careful script. The paper was yellowed with age, and he could see tear stains on the ink. At the top, It was dated March 10, 1969, just 2 weeks after Margaret had disappeared from his life. "My dearest Garth," the letter began, "by the time you read this, you will be a grown man, and I will likely be an old woman. I pray that you will be able to forgive me for the pain my absence has caused you." Garth's voice broke as he read aloud without thinking, sharing this most intimate moment with 1,200 strangers who had become witnesses to his healing. "Your father believes it is best if I stay away. The divorce was bitter, and in his anger toward your grandfather, he has decided that you and your siblings should have no contact with our side of the family. He says it will be easier for you to grow up without the confusion of divided loyalties. I have tried to fight this decision, but the courts have ruled in your father's favor. I am not allowed to see you, to call you, to send you birthday cards or Christmas presents. But I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't thought of you, prayed for you, and loved you with every fiber of my being." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Garth looked up at Margaret, who was openly sobbing now, supported by Sarah, who was crying just as hard. "I kept every newspaper clipping," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the silent theater. "Every magazine article, every review of your concerts. I watched you on television whenever I could. I bought every album, learned every song. I have been so proud of the man you became, so proud of your music, your family, your heart." Garth closed the album and set it carefully beside him on the stage. Without hesitation, he jumped down into the audience, ignoring the security guards who moved forward in surprise. He walked directly to Margaret, and for a moment they just looked at each other. The superstar and the elderly woman who had shaped his earliest understanding of love. Then Margaret reached up and touched his face with her weathered hand, just as she had when he was small and needed comfort. "My sweet boy," she whispered, "you're even more beautiful than I dreamed you'd be." Garth wrapped his arms around her tiny frame and held her close, both of them crying openly now. The audience sat in respectful silence, many wiping away their own tears as they witnessed this reunion decades in the making. "I thought you were dead," Garth whispered into her silver hair. "Dad told me you died when I was 6. I've grieved for you my whole life." "I know, baby," Margaret whispered back. "I know. And I'm so sorry. So very sorry." As they held each other, Trisha made her way down from the stage, her own face streaked with tears. She had heard enough of Garth's childhood stories to understand the magnitude of this moment. This woman had been his anchor during some of his most formative years, and her sudden disappearance had left a wound that had never fully healed. When Garth and Margaret finally separated, he turned to the audience, his face raw with emotion, but somehow more peaceful than it had been at the beginning of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick but steady, "I think we're going to need to take a different direction with tonight's show." The Majestic Theater had been transformed from a concert venue into something resembling a family reunion, though the family in question had been separated for nearly 5 decades. After the initial reunion between Garth and Margaret, the show had naturally evolved into something no one in attendance would ever forget. Garth had invited Margaret and Sarah onto the stage, where 3 chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. The audience, initially uncertain about whether they were intruding on a private moment, had been warmly invited to stay by Garth himself, who seemed to understand that this story needed witnesses, that some truths required community to be fully acknowledged. Trisha sat beside her husband, holding his hand as Margaret slowly settled into her chair, with Sarah's help. The album lay open on Garth's lap, and he found himself touching the photographs as if to convince himself they were real. "I need to understand," Garth said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the theater's excellent acoustics. "I need to understand what really happened, Grandma Maggie. The story I was told, it never made sense to me, even as a child." Margaret nodded, her hands folded in her lap. Despite her age and the emotional intensity of the reunion, she appeared determined to tell her story completely, as if she'd been rehearsing this moment for decades. "Your grandfather, Robert Hayes, and your father never got along," she began, her voice steady now that the initial shock of reunion had passed. "Even before your mother married Raymond, there was tension. Robert he was a proud man. Maybe too proud. When your parents were struggling financially in those early years, he wanted to help more than your father was comfortable accepting." Sarah, who had remained quietly supportive, reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand encouragingly. It was clear this wasn't the first time she'd heard this story, but also that some details were new even to her. "Tell me about the divorce," Garth said gently. "I remember there being arguments, but I was so young. I remember you crying and Grandpa Robert being angry, but I never understood why." Margaret's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking back across the decades to those painful days. "Your grandfather and I divorced in 1968. It wasn't because we didn't love each other. We did. Deeply. But Robert had made some business decisions that your father disapproved of, and when those decisions affected the family financially, your father blamed Robert for putting you children at risk." She paused, gathering strength for the hardest part of the story. "The truth is, Robert had co-signed a loan for a friend's business venture. When that business failed, we lost almost everything. Our house, our savings, even the small inheritance I'd planned to leave to you and your siblings someday." Trisha squeezed Garth's hand tighter, understanding how this revelation must be affecting him. His music had always been deeply rooted in themes of family loyalty and the struggles of working-class people trying to build better lives for their children. "Your father was furious," Margaret continued. "He felt that Robert had been reckless with the family's security, and he wasn't entirely wrong. But Robert was devastated by what had happened. He'd only wanted to help a friend, and instead, he'd hurt the people he loved most." "So you divorced because of the financial problems?" Garth asked. "We divorced because Robert couldn't live with the guilt, and I couldn't watch him destroy himself over it," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "He started drinking heavily, and our marriage became difficult. I thought if we separated, he might find a way to forgive himself and get the help he needed." The theater remained completely silent, the audience understanding they were witnessing not just a reunion, but the healing of generational wounds. "But the divorce made your father even angrier," Margaret continued. "He saw it as proof that the Hayes family was unstable, that we would continue to bring chaos into your lives. When the custody arrangements were being discussed, he made it clear that he didn't want you children to have any contact with either Robert or me." Garth shook his head, struggling to process this information. "But you were never part of the financial problems. You had always been there for us. You were the one who took care of us when Mom and Dad were working." "I tried to explain that to the court," Margaret said, tears beginning to flow again. "But your father painted a picture of our entire family as irresponsible and potentially harmful to your development. He had witnesses who testified about Robert's drinking, about the financial instability. The judge decided that a clean break would be best for you children." Sarah spoke up for the first time since they'd taken the stage. "Grandma fought for 2 years to get visitation rights. She spent what little money she had left on lawyers, trying to prove that she could be a positive influence in your lives without bringing any of the problems that had affected Grandpa Robert. I never knew, Garth whispered. I never knew you tried to come back. The final court order was issued in March of 1969, Margaret said. I was prohibited from any contact with you or your siblings until you reached the age of 18. By then, your father had told you I was dead, and I didn't know how to come back from that. How do you tell a child that the adults in their life have been lying to them for over a decade? The weight of this revelation settled over the stage like a heavy blanket. Garth looked down at the album in his lap, understanding now why every photo was accompanied by such detailed notes. Margaret had been documenting their relationship as if she knew it might be taken away. What happened to Grandpa Robert? Garth asked quietly. Margaret's face crumpled. He never forgave himself. He tried to get sober several times, but the guilt was too much. He died in 1973, still believing that his mistake had cost him his family forever. Oh, Grandma, Garth said, reaching over to take her hand. He must have been in so much pain. We all were, Margaret said simply. But Robert carried it differently. He couldn't see past his mistake to remember all the love he'd given, all the joy he'd brought to our lives. He only saw the harm he'd caused. Trisha, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Margaret, what gave you the courage to come tonight? What made you decide to break that decades-old silence? Margaret looked at Trisha with obvious affection. I've been following Garth's career since the beginning, and I've watched him in interviews talking about family, about the importance of honoring your roots, but I've also heard him mention the loss of his grandmother, the sadness in his voice when he talks about not having those family connections that go back generations. She turned back to Garth. Last month, I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The doctors say I have good years left, but I also know that my time for clear thinking and clear memories is limited. I couldn't risk dying with this secret, leaving you to live your whole life believing a lie about how much you were loved. The diagnosis hit everyone on the stage like a physical blow. Garth immediately moved his chair closer to Margaret's, taking both of her hands in his. How long have you been in touch with our family? He asked Sarah. Sarah smiled through her tears. Grandma Maggie found me about 15 years ago. I'm actually your cousin. My mother was Robert's daughter from his first marriage. Grandma had lost touch with most of the family after the divorce, but she hired a private investigator to help her reconnect with the Hayes side of the family tree. She's been like a second grandmother to my children, Sarah continued. They know all about their famous cousin Garth, and they've grown up with stories about what a sweet, talented little boy you were. Garth looked at Margaret with wonder. You've been watching over us all this time. As much as I could, Margaret confirmed. I know about your children, your marriage to Sandy, your marriage to Trisha. I know about your struggles early in your career, your decision to retire to focus on family, your comeback tours. I've celebrated every success and worried through every challenge, just like any grandmother would. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I've written you a letter every year on your birthday since 1969. 47 letters that I never sent. But that helped me feel connected to you anyway. The simple gesture, this evidence of decades of unspoken love, seemed to overwhelm Garth completely. He leaned forward and rested his head on Margaret's shoulder, something he hadn't done since he was 6 years old. I've missed you so much, he whispered. I've missed you every day of my life. I know, sweet boy, Margaret whispered back, stroking his hair just as she had when he was small. I've missed you too. As the stage lights cast long shadows across the 3 generations of family members, the audience began to understand that they weren't just witnessing a reunion. They were witnessing the beginning of a healing process that would need to involve not just Garth and Margaret, but everyone who had been affected by the decades-long separation. In the wings, theater staff members wiped away tears as they realized this was no longer a concert, but something much more sacred. The restoration of a family bond that had been broken by pride, fear, and misunderstanding, but preserved by the kind of unconditional love that transcends time and circumstances. The revelation of Margaret's presence and the truth about her disappearance had shifted something fundamental in the theater. What had begun as an intimate concert had become a public confession, a communal witnessing of pain that had been carried in silence for decades. As the initial shock settled, harder questions began to surface. Garth sat quietly for several minutes, his hands still holding the photo album, his mind clearly racing through memories and trying to reconcile the story he'd always known with this new truth. Trisha watched her husband carefully, recognizing the signs of his internal processing, the way his jaw tightened when he was working through complex emotions, the distant look in his eyes when he was connecting pieces of a puzzle. Finally, he looked up at Margaret, his expression both tender and troubled. "Grandma Maggie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Margaret nodded, straightening in her chair despite her obvious fatigue. "Anything, sweetheart. Did you ever try to contact me directly? Not through the courts, but just, did you ever try to reach out to me personally after I turned 18? The question hung in the air, and Margaret's face showed she had been dreading this moment. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly aware of whatever her grandmother was about to reveal. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I tried several times." Garth's expression tightened. "When?" "The first time was on your 19th birthday, in 1981. I called your college dorm room. A young man answered. I assume it was your roommate. And when I said I was your grandmother, he said you'd told him your grandparents were all dead. He hung up before I could explain." The words hit Garth like a physical blow. He remembered that phone call vividly now. His roommate Mike had mentioned it later, saying some older woman had called claiming to be family, but that he'd figured it was either a mistake or some kind of scam. "I tried again when you got your first record deal," Margaret continued, her voice growing smaller. "I called the record company and asked them to pass along a message, to let you know that your grandmother, Margaret Hayes, was trying to reach you. They said they'd pass it along, but I never got the message," Garth finished, his voice hollow. "I tried once more in 1995, right after your daughter Taylor was born. I saw the announcement in People magazine, and I thought maybe becoming a father yourself might make you more open to hearing from me. I called the number listed for your management company." Trisha's eyes widened as she realized the implications. "That was during the height of your stalker problems," she said to Garth. "Remember? You were getting so many inappropriate calls and letters that management was screening everything extremely carefully." Garth nodded slowly, the memory coming back to him. There had been a period in the mid-1990s when his fame had attracted some genuinely dangerous attention, including one fan who had made credible threats against his family. His management team had implemented strict protocols about unsolicited contact from people claiming to be family or friends. "After that," Margaret said, "I decided it was too late. You were living your life, building your career, raising your family. What right did I have to disrupt all of that with ancient history?" "Every right," Garth said firmly. "You had every right. You were my grandmother. You helped raise me." Margaret shook her head sadly. "But I was also the grandmother who had disappeared from your life without explanation. In your mind, I was dead. How could I expect you to believe me? How could I expect you to welcome me back after so many years of absence?" Sarah leaned forward, speaking directly to Garth. "She's been carrying this guilt for decades. She convinced herself that your father was right, that staying away was the kindest thing she could do for you." "But it wasn't kind," Garth said, his voice rising slightly with emotion. "It wasn't kind to any of us. I spent years thinking I had imagined how close we were, thinking that maybe my memories of you were just childhood fantasies." He stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the stage, looking out at the audience who had been silent witnesses to this unfolding drama. Many of them were crying openly, and he could see in their faces the recognition of their own family wounds, their own experiences with secrets and separations. "You know what the hardest part was?" Garth said, turning back to Margaret. "It wasn't just losing you. It was losing the part of myself that you had helped create. You were the one who first encouraged my music. You were the one who taught me that stories mattered, that songs could heal people's hearts." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You remember that?" "Of course I remember that," Garth said, his voice breaking. "You used to sit me on your lap and sing old folk songs. You'd tell me that music was magic because it could make people feel less alone in the world. Every time I step on a stage, I carry that lesson with me." He sat back down, closer to her this time. "But I also carried the wound of losing you. It affected every relationship I've ever had. I've spent my whole adult life terrified that the people I love most will disappear without warning." Trisha reached over and squeezed his hand, understanding now some things about her husband that had puzzled her over the years. His intense need for reassurance, his sometimes irrational fear that she might leave him, the way he held their children just a little too tightly during bedtime routines. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry I caused you that pain." "It wasn't just you," Garth said, and for the first time there was anger in his voice, not directed at Margaret, but at the situation itself. "It was the adults who decided that protecting us from confusion was more important than allowing us to love and be loved by everyone who wanted to be part of our lives." He turned to address the audience again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades thinking about family, loss, and the power of truth. "How many of you have family members you've lost touch with because of pride or anger or misunderstandings?" he asked. The question was rhetorical, but he could see the recognition in faces throughout the theater. "How many of you are carrying wounds from separations that maybe didn't have to happen?" A woman in the front row called out, "I haven't spoken to my sister in 12 years. A man near the back added, "My kids don't know my father because of something that happened before they were born." More voices joined in, sharing fragments of their own family fractures. Garth nodded, understanding that Margaret's story was resonating because it reflected a common human experience, the way pride and fear could separate people who genuinely loved each other. "The thing is," Garth continued, looking back at Margaret, "we can't get back those 47 years. We can't undo the missed birthdays, the holidays you weren't there for, the times I needed my grandmother and thought she was gone forever." Margaret's face crumpled at these words, and for a moment it seemed like the weight of all those lost years might be too much for her to bear. "But," Garth continued, his voice softening, "we can choose what happens next. We can choose whether to let the anger about what we lost prevent us from celebrating what we've found." He knelt beside Margaret's chair and took her hands in his. "Grandma Maggie, I can't speak for my siblings yet. They'll need to process this in their own way. But I can speak for myself. I forgive you for staying away, even though I wish you hadn't. I forgive the fear that kept you silent, even though it hurt us both. And I want you to know that finding you again, right now, tonight, feels like the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was still praying. Margaret's tears were flowing freely now, but her face was radiant with relief and joy. Thank you, my sweet boy. Thank you for being the man I always knew you would become. As they embraced again, Sarah spoke up with a practical concern that had been weighing on her mind. Uncle Garth, there's something else you need to know about Grandma's condition. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was recent, but she's been showing signs of memory problems for the past year. Some days are better than others, but we don't know how much time we have before she starts forgetting things, Garth finished, understanding immediately. Sarah nodded. That's part of why I finally convinced her to come tonight. We realized that if she was going to reconnect with family, it had to be soon, while she's still able to remember and process everything clearly. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Margaret had waited decades to reveal the truth, only to discover that her time for making new memories was now limited. But rather than diminishing the joy of their reunion, this knowledge seemed to make every moment more precious. Trisha, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, finally spoke up with characteristic directness. Then we don't waste any more time on regrets. We focus on making the most of whatever time we have together. She looked at Margaret with genuine warmth. I know this is overwhelming, and I know Garth is going to need time to process everything. But I want you to know that you're welcome in our family, not just as Garth's grandmother, but as our grandmother too. Our kids should know their great-grandmother while they still can. Margaret's face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. You would really want that? Even after all this time, all this pain? Especially after all this time, Trisha said firmly. Our family has been missing pieces without even knowing it. Now that we've found you, we're not letting you go again. As the three generations sat together on the stage, surrounded by an audience who had become inadvertent witnesses to this healing, it was clear that the evening had become something none of them would ever forget. The concert had ended, but something much more important had begun. The careful, precious work of rebuilding a family bond that had been broken by secrets, but preserved by love. In the wings, the theater manager stood with tears in his eyes, knowing that this was the kind of moment that made his venue more than just a building. It was a place where human stories unfolded, where healing happened in public and private simultaneously, where music revealed its deepest truth as a force for connection and reconciliation. 3 weeks after the life-changing evening at the Majestic Theater, the Brooks family home in Nashville had been transformed into a hub of activity unlike anything it had seen before. What had once been a quiet sanctuary where Garth and Trisha retreated from the demands of their careers was now filled with the sounds of a family learning to be whole again. Margaret had accepted Garth and Trisha's invitation to stay with them while they figured out the next steps. The guest room on the main floor had been converted into a comfortable suite for her, complete with medical equipment Sarah had recommended, and a daily caregiver named Patricia Williams, a warm African-American woman in her 50s who specialized in working with Alzheimer's patients. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret sat at the large oak table, carefully organizing the contents of several boxes that Sarah had driven down from Texas. These boxes contained 47 years of Garth's life, as experienced from a distance. Newspaper clippings, magazine articles, concert programs, and, yes, those annual birthday letters she had never sent. Garth entered the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving slowly in the way of someone still adjusting to a new reality. The past 3 weeks had been emotionally exhausting as he worked to process decades of misdirected grief, and recalibrate his understanding of his own life story. "Good morning, Grandma Maggie," he said, setting one of the cups beside her. The simple act of saying those words still felt surreal, like speaking a language he'd thought he'd forgotten. "Good morning, sweet boy," Margaret replied, looking up at him with eyes that were bright and clear. Today was one of her good days, when the progressive disease remained in the background and she was fully present and alert. Garth sat down across from her and gestured to the boxes. "Tell me about the letters." Margaret's hands stilled over the papers she'd been sorting. This was a conversation they'd been dancing around since her arrival, the evidence of her decades-long vigil, her one-sided relationship with a grandson who had believed she was dead. "Are you sure you want to read them?" she asked. "Some of them might be difficult. I wasn't always kind to your father in those early years." "I think I need to read them," Garth said quietly. "All of them. I need to understand what those years were like for you." Margaret nodded and reached into the nearest box, pulling out a shoebox that had been carefully labeled by year. She opened it and withdrew the first letter, dated February 7th, 1969, Garth's 7th birthday. "This was the hardest one to write," she said, passing it to him. "Your first birthday after I was gone." Garth unfolded the letter, written on simple stationery in Margaret's careful script. "My dearest Garth, today you turn 7 years old, and I am not there to make you pancakes shaped like guitars or to sing happy birthday while you blow out your candles. I don't know if your father even told you it's your birthday, or if he's trying to erase all the traditions we shared together. I imagine you're wondering where I am, why I haven't come to see you. Your father has told you I'm dead, hasn't he? It breaks my heart to think of you grieving for me while I'm alive and missing you every second of every day. I want you to know that wherever you are, whatever you're doing today, I am thinking of you. I am remembering the little boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to sing the sleepy songs. I am remembering your laugh, your curiosity about everything, the way you would hum melodies that came from somewhere deep in your soul. Happy birthday, my sweet boy. I love you more than all the stars in the sky." Grandma Maggie Garth's hands trembled as he finished reading. The raw pain in his grandmother's words, written when his own memories of her were still fresh and sharp, hit him like a physical blow. "She was right," he said quietly. "Dad told us you died in a car accident. He said it was too painful to talk about, so we never questioned it." Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. "I don't blame him anymore, sweetheart. I was angry for years, but I understand now that he thought he was protecting you children from a complicated situation." "But you weren't complicated," Garth protested. "You were love. You were safety. You were music and stories and everything that made me feel secure in the world." Before Margaret could respond, the kitchen door opened and Trisha entered with their youngest daughter, Allie, who was now 28, but still lived nearby and visited frequently. Allie had been struggling with the revelation about her great-grandmother, trying to understand how such a significant person could have been missing from her father's life for so long. "Morning, Daddy," Allie said, kissing Garth's cheek before turning to Margaret with a shy smile. "Good morning, Great-Grandma Maggie." The title still felt awkward on everyone's tongue, but Margaret's face lit up every time one of Garth's children used it. She had missed 3 generations of her family. Garth's children had grown up and started their own lives without ever knowing she existed. "Good morning, beautiful girl," Margaret said warmly. "Did you bring more pictures like you promised?" Allie nodded and sat down, pulling out her phone. Over the past few weeks, She had been showing Margaret photos and videos of family events, trying to fill in some of the gaps in her great-grandmother's knowledge of their lives. "This is from Taylor's wedding last year," Allie said, scrolling through photos. "And here's August graduating from college. Oh, and here's Dad crying during my college graduation speech." "I did not cry," Garth protested, but he was smiling. "You absolutely did," Trisha said, pouring herself coffee and joining them at the table. "You cried through the entire ceremony." Margaret studied each photo carefully, memorizing faces and moments she would never be able to experience firsthand, but could at least witness in retrospect. The cruelty of timing wasn't lost on any of them. She was meeting her great-grandchildren as adults, missing entirely their childhoods, their first steps, their school plays, their teenage heartbreaks. "Tell me about when they were little," Margaret said to Garth. "I want to hear everything." For the next hour, Garth and Trisha took turns sharing stories about their children's childhoods, painting pictures with words of the family life Margaret had missed. She listened with intense concentration, occasionally asking questions or making connections to Garth's own childhood behavior. "Taylor was just like you were," she told Garth at one point. "Even as a baby, you would get this faraway look in your eyes when music was playing, like you were hearing something the rest of us couldn't quite catch." "She still gets that look," Trisha said. "She's incredibly musical, just like her father." The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Patricia, the caregiver, went to answer it and returned with Sarah, who had driven up from Texas for her weekly visit. But she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a man in his 60s with familiar pale blue eyes and Garth's distinctive jawline. "Uncle Garth," Sarah said, her voice tight with nervousness, "I brought someone I think you should meet. This is my uncle, your uncle, Thomas Robert Hayes. He's Grandpa Robert's son from his first marriage." The kitchen fell silent as everyone processed this information. Margaret's face went white, then flushed with emotion. She had lost touch with Robert's children after their divorce, another casualty of the family's fractures. Thomas stepped forward hesitantly, clearly as overwhelmed as everyone else. "I heard about what happened at your concert," he said to Garth. "Sarah reached out to me. Thought maybe it was time for all the secrets to come out." Garth stood slowly, studying this man who represented yet another lost piece of his family puzzle. Thomas was tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of years of manual labor and eyes that held the same gentle sadness Garth remembered in his grandfather Robert. "I'm your Uncle Tommy," Thomas said simply. "I was 17 when you were born, and I used to babysit you sometimes when Mama Margaret and Dad needed a break. You probably don't remember me." But Garth did remember, suddenly and vividly. Images flashed through his mind of a teenage boy teaching him to throw a baseball, reading him comic books, letting him help work on car engines in the garage behind Margaret's house. "Tommy," Garth breathed, "you taught me to whistle." Thomas's face broke into a grin that transformed his weathered features. "You remember that? You were maybe 4 years old, and you were so determined to learn. You practiced for weeks until you could whistle, 'Mary Had a Little Lamb.'" The two men embraced, another bridge rebuilt across decades of separation. As they held each other, Thomas whispered, "I'm sorry about Dad. I'm sorry about all of it. Our family fell apart, and too many people got hurt." "We can't change what happened," Garth said, echoing the wisdom he'd found over the past few weeks. "But we can choose what happens next." As the family, now unexpectedly expanded by 2 more members, settled around the kitchen table, Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her. For the first time in 47 years, she was not observing her grandson's life from a distance. She was part of it, present for it, included in the daily rhythms of love and conversation that make up a family's life. "Thomas," she said, reaching for his hand, "tell me about your children. Tell me about the grandchildren I've never met." As Thomas began sharing stories about his own family, Garth realized that the evening at the Majestic Theater had done more than reunite him with his grandmother. It had revealed the existence of an entire extended family he'd never known he had. Cousins, second cousins, great-nieces and nephews who carried the same Hayes blood and possibly the same musical gifts. The kitchen filled with voices as multiple conversations bloomed. Trisha and Sarah comparing notes about caring for aging parents, Allie and Thomas discovering shared interests, Margaret asking endless questions about everyone's lives and careers. The cacophony was overwhelming and beautiful, the sound of a family knitting itself back together one story at a time. Later that afternoon, as the extended family gathering continued in the living room, Garth found himself alone with Margaret on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the Nashville sky in shades of gold and pink. "Are you okay with all of this?" he asked her. "It's a lot of people, a lot of emotion. I know your doctors said we should be careful not to overwhelm you." Margaret smiled, her eyes clear and peaceful. "Sweet boy, I've been overwhelmed by sadness and regret for 47 years. Being overwhelmed by love and family is the most beautiful feeling I've ever experienced." She reached over and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I need to tell you something important, while I'm still able to say it clearly." Garth turned to face her, giving her his full attention. "I know my memory is going to get worse," she said. "There may come a time when I don't remember who you are, when I don't remember any of this beautiful reunion we've had." "Grandma, let me finish," she said gently. "When that time comes, I don't want you to be sad about it. I want you to remember that right now, in this moment, I am completely here with you. I remember everything about loving you, about being proud of you, about the joy of finding you again." She squeezed his hand tighter. "And I want you to know that even if my mind forgets, my heart will remember. Love doesn't live in memory, sweetheart. It lives in something deeper than that, something that can't be taken away by disease or time or even death." As the sun set behind the hills surrounding their home, grandmother and grandson sat together in comfortable silence, both understanding that they were living in a grace period, a time when love had been restored, family had been reunited, and healing was possible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as family should. 6 months had passed since that transformative evening at the Majestic Theater, and the approaching Christmas season carried special significance for the Brooks family. For the first time in nearly 5 decades, 4 generations would be celebrating together, creating new traditions while honoring old ones that had been interrupted by decades of separation. The family room in the Nashville home had been transformed into a wonderland of Christmas decorations, but these weren't the usual store-bought ornaments. Instead, the tree was decorated with handmade items that told the story of their reunited family. Photo ornaments featuring images from Margaret's album, small guitars crafted by Thomas, who turned out to be a talented woodworker, and angels made by Margaret during her clearer moments, each one carefully labeled with a family member's name. Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a quilt that Sarah had brought from Texas. Her condition had progressed somewhat over the past months. She had more difficult days now, moments when the past and present blended together in confusion. But today was one of her good days, and her eyes were bright with anticipation. The house was filled with the controlled chaos of a large family gathering. Garth's 3 daughters were there with their own families. Thomas had brought his children and grandchildren from Oklahoma, and Sarah had driven up with her husband and teenage children. The kitchen was bustling with the preparation of Christmas dinner, with Trisha orchestrating the meal, while various family members contributed dishes and stories. But the most significant preparation had been happening for weeks. Garth had been working on something special, something that would honor both the pain and the joy of their family's journey. "Grandma Maggie," he said, settling onto the ottoman in front of her chair, "I have something I want to share with you and the family today." Margaret's face lit up with curiosity. Over the past months, she had rediscovered the joy of being surprised, of having her grandson include her in his creative process, the way she had included him in hers when he was small. "Is it a new song?" she asked, her voice carrying the excitement of a child. "It is," Garth confirmed. "But it's more than that. It's a story I've been trying to tell for most of my life, and I finally understand how it ends." He stood and walked to the piano that had been moved into the family room for the occasion. The entire family gradually gathered around, conversations quieting as they sensed something important was about to happen. "Before I play this," Garth said, looking around at the faces of his extended family, "I want to explain what the past 6 months have meant to me. When Grandma Maggie walked back into my life, she didn't just return as a person I had lost. She returned as the keeper of stories I had forgotten, the holder of memories I thought were gone forever." He looked directly at Margaret, whose eyes were focused on him with complete attention. "She reminded me that love doesn't disappear just because we can't see it. It continues, it grows, it waits for us to be ready to receive it again." Garth began to play, his fingers finding a melody that was both familiar and entirely new. The song that emerged was unlike anything he had written before. It was deeply personal yet universal, specific to his family's journey, yet speaking to the experience of anyone who had ever lost someone they loved. "There's a voice that calls across the years, through the laughter and the tears. It's the song of love that never dies, even when we say goodbye. I thought I'd lost you long ago, to the place where memories go. But love is stronger than goodbye. It never really says farewell." Grandma's hands, they held me tight, through the darkness of the night. Though the years have passed us by, love is stronger than goodbye. As he sang, Garth's voice carried the weight of all the years of separation, all the grief he had carried for a woman he thought was dead, and all the joy of discovering that love had been waiting for him all along. The melody was simple enough that family members began humming along, creating a harmony that filled the room with something approaching the sacred. Margaret was crying openly now, but her tears were joyful ones. She began to sing along with the chorus, her voice thin but clear, adding harmonies that came from some deep place of musical understanding she shared with her grandson. When the song ended, the room remained silent for several moments, everyone processing the emotional impact of what they had just experienced. "That's beautiful, Daddy," Taylor said, wiping away tears. "Is it going on your next album?" Garth shook his head. "No, sweetheart. This song isn't for the world. It's for us. It's for our family. It's a song that will live in this room, in our hearts, in the stories we tell our children and grandchildren about how love can survive anything." Thomas, who had been quietly emotional throughout the performance, spoke up from his position near the window. "Uncle Garth, there's something I need to tell everyone, something about Dad, about Grandpa Robert, that might help complete this story." The family turned their attention to Thomas, who looked nervous but determined. "I've been carrying a secret too," he said. "When Dad died in 1973, he left behind some things. Letters he'd written but never sent, recordings he'd made on an old tape recorder. I was young and angry, and I put them away, thinking I never wanted to deal with them. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cassette tape, worn with age. Last month, after meeting all of you, I finally listened to these. Dad recorded messages for Garth and his siblings every year on their birthdays, just like Mama Margaret wrote her letters. He never stopped loving you, never stopped regretting the choices that separated our family. Margaret's hand flew to her heart. Robert made recordings? 24 of them, Thomas confirmed, from 1969 until the year he died. He was trying to find the courage to reach out, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap that had grown between him and your side of the family. Garth stared at the cassette tape as if it were a holy relic. He remembered our birthdays? Every single one, Thomas said, and he recorded himself singing the lullabies he used to sing to you when you were little, the same ones Mama Margaret sang. The revelation hit the family like a gentle earthquake, reshaping their understanding once again. Robert hadn't been just the man whose financial mistakes had torn the family apart. He had also been a grandfather whose heart had been broken by the consequences of his actions, who had spent his final years loving his grandchildren from a distance just as Margaret had done. Can we listen to one? Garth asked quietly. Thomas nodded and handed him the tape. I brought a player, too, just in case. As the old cassette player crackled to life, Robert's voice filled the room. Older than Garth remembered, roughened by years of struggle and regret, but unmistakably the voice of the grandfather who had taught him to fish and told him stories about their family's history. Hello, Garth. It's your birthday. You're turning 10 today, and I wonder if you even remember me anymore. I hope your father has found it in his heart to tell you some good stories about your old granddad, though I suppose I understand if he hasn't. I want you to know that I think about you every day, son. I think about the little boy who used to help me in the garden, who asked a million questions about everything he saw. I hope you're still curious about the world. I hope you're still singing those little songs you used to make up. I made some mistakes, Garth. Big ones that hurt the people I loved most. But I need you to know that losing you and your brother and sisters has been the hardest punishment I've ever faced. If I could take back what I did, if I could undo the pain I caused, I would do it in a heartbeat. Happy birthday, grandson. I love you more than you'll ever know. The tape continued for several more minutes, with Robert singing, You Are My Sunshine, in a voice that wavered with emotion and age. By the time it ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Margaret was sobbing quietly, grieving anew for the man she had divorced, but never stopped loving, understanding now that he had carried the same burden of loss and regret that she had carried. He never stopped loving us, she whispered. All those years, I thought he had moved on, found peace somewhere else. But he was missing us just as much as I was missing all of you. Garth knelt beside her chair and took her hands. Grandma, what do you think Grandpa Robert would say if he could see us all here together today? Margaret's face, despite being streaked with tears, radiated pure joy. I think he would say that love always finds a way home. It might take 47 years. It might require miracles and coincidences and brave granddaughters who drive their grandmothers to concerts, but love always finds a way. As Christmas dinner was served later that afternoon, 4 generations of the Hayes and Brooks families gathered around a table that had been extended with every leaf and surrounded by mismatched chairs borrowed from throughout the house. The conversation flowed in multiple directions, children comparing their latest adventures, adults sharing work stories and memories, elderly voices adding wisdom and historical context to every topic. Margaret, seated in the place of honor at Garth's right hand, looked around the table with wonder. The progression of her disease meant that she might not remember this day clearly in a few months, but right now, in this moment, she was completely present for the joy of being surrounded by the family she had mourned for decades. "I want to say something," she announced, her voice cutting through the cheerful chaos. The table gradually quieted, all attention focusing on her. "6 months ago, I was a lonely old woman carrying a secret that was eating me alive. I was convinced that I had lost my chance to be part of this family, that too much time had passed, too much pain had been caused for healing to be possible." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "But look at us now. Look at this beautiful, complicated, wonderful family that has grown from the ashes of old hurts and misunderstandings. We are proof that it's never too late for love to triumph over fear." She raised her glass of sweet tea in a toast. "To Robert, who loved us even when we couldn't be together. To Sarah, who was brave enough to drive an old woman to Dallas. To Garth and Trisha, who opened their hearts and their home. To Thomas, who preserved his father's voice so we could hear it again. To all the children and grandchildren who have welcomed me into their lives without question or judgment. And to second chances," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "To the possibility that our broken places can become our strongest places, that our greatest sorrows can become our greatest joys, that families can be rebuilt even when they've been broken for longer than some of us have been alive." The toast was echoed around the table, glasses raised, and voices joined in celebration of redemption, reunion, and the mysterious ways that love persists across time and circumstances. As the evening wound down and family members began the reluctant process of saying goodbye, Garth found himself on the front porch with Margaret, both of them wrapped in blankets against the December chill. "Grandma," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. These past 6 months haven't just been about getting to know you again. They've been about understanding who I am, where my music comes from, why family has always meant so much to me." Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. "You planted seeds in me when I was little," he said. "Seeds of melody, of storytelling, of believing that music could heal people's hearts. Everything I've built in my career, everything I've tried to give to audiences around the world, it all started in your lap when you sang me those old songs. And now," he continued, "watching you with my children, seeing how they light up when you tell them stories about their father as a little boy, watching you teach Allie to play the piano the same way you taught me, I understand that some gifts skip across generations, that love creates legacies that endure even when the people we love can't be physically present." Margaret reached over and touched his face, her hand gentle but sure. "Sweet boy, you have given me the greatest gift I could have ever imagined. You've given me the chance to see that my love mattered, that it made a difference, that it helped create something beautiful in this world." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with mischief despite her age and illness. "And you've given me the chance to spoil my great-grandchildren the way I never got to spoil my grandchildren. That's not nothing, you know." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the clear winter sky. Both understood that their time together was precious and limited. But instead of dwelling on what they might lose, they chose to celebrate what they had found. Inside the house, the sounds of family continued. Children playing games, adults cleaning up from dinner, the comfortable noise of people who belonged together. It was a symphony Margaret had thought she would never hear again. And Garth realized he had been waiting his whole life to feel this complete sense of family wholeness. The album that had started it all sat on the coffee table inside, its pages now familiar to everyone in the family. But it was no longer a repository of lost memories. It had become the foundation for new ones, the bridge between past and present that had made their future possible. As Margaret dozed in her chair, her head resting peacefully against Garth's shoulder, he hummed quietly the melody of the song he had written for her, the song that would live forever in their family's collection of private treasures. It was a song about love being stronger than goodbye, about the ways that hearts remember even when minds forget, about the miracle of finding each other again after decades of separation. In the distance, Nashville's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and the music city that had given Garth his career seemed to pulse with the rhythm of reunion, redemption, and the eternal truth that love, real, persistent, unconditional love, always finds a way home.